The exact same man who just said the words "In God We Trust" are on the walls of government buildings and printed on our money is also turning around 2 sentences later and saying that he's not allowed to speak about religion other than hushed tones because the atheists are going to come get him. Give me a break. Choose one. Which is it? You're not persecuted. Grow up. Hello again, and welcome back to this episode of Growing Up Fundie. I am your host, Sydney Davis Jr., and today we're going to do something a little bit different than we normally do. Today we're going to dissect and totally take apart a book that I've been reading. I say reading, I use that term very liberally because I could hardly make it through the first chapter before I realized how entirely difficult it was going to be to fit one chapter into a single episode of this podcast. And here's why. I'll explain. So the book that I have right here in my hands is called Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking the Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God by Anthony DeStefano. I don't know. So this book, ladies and gentlemen, let me just tell you about it. So I saw this book online, and initially I purchased it because, as anybody who's ever listened to this podcast knows, I like to get a very round collection of opinions. I don't just want to surround myself with everybody who shares the same opinion as me. I really like to read the perspective of people who are the antithesis of what I believe. It's very important to me. I think that's the only way that you can grow smarter is if you do the kind of research that makes you uncomfortable or makes you face sides of argumentations that might oppose how you believe and make you stand up for yourself and make you prove to yourself and to others why it is that you believe what it is you believe or say what you say, etc., etc. You feel me. I'm open-minded. So when I got this book, it was basically marketed as a book to prove that atheists don't know what they're talking about and they're super cocky and arrogant. And so I wanted to read it because I wanted to see, is this true? Do I see myself in any of these descriptions? However, what I got is something much, much different. Let me just start from the very beginning. I didn't notice this when I first started reading the book, but the very first page when you open the book is quotes from people who praise this book, who praise Inside the Atheist Mind. And all I'm going to say on this is the 3 people they choose to quote are Mike Huckabee, Glenn Beck, and Rick Santorum. So if you don't know who those are, highly recommend you Google them. But all I'm saying is those are the 3 people who apparently loved this book to death, which tells you a lot. Now, the second thing I want to do really quick, I know this is going to sound kind of boring, but it's very important, is I want to go over a few definitions before we really dive in and get started. So a little bit of background, I was a debater for many years. It's how I paid my way through college. I was a professional level debater. I, not to brag, was in the top 3 speakers in the nation and the top 8 debaters in the nation at one point for IPDA. That means nothing to people that means nothing to. But anyway, I'm saying that to say, definitions and research and argumentation are very important to me, and so I want to make sure that we have these very specific definitions that are going to come into play as we dissect the first part of this reading. And you'll see what I mean when we get there, but for now, just bear with me. The first definition we're going to discuss is appeal to hypocrisy, and this is a type of fallacy. So what is appeal to hypocrisy? Appeal to hypocrisy focuses on the hypocrisy of an opponent, deflecting criticism away from oneself by accusing the other person of the same problem or something comparable. So basically, appeal to hypocrisy is an argumentation style. It's a fallacy where instead of actually arguing the point, your opponent just basically says you are as guilty as they are about what they did, and they try to deflect by making you look like a hypocrite, when in reality, they are the hypocrite because they're the one doing the exact same thing as you, but they're trying to make you look worse. Kind of like those people who get mad at you for checking their phone, even though when you checked their phone, they were cheating, that sort of thing. The second definition we're going to cover is ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem fallacy uses personal attacks rather than logic. This fallacy occurs when someone rejects or criticizes another point of view based on personal characteristics, ethnic background, or other non-relevant traits of the person who holds it. So, those Facebook arguments we get in where when people are losing, all they do is start calling you fat or lazy or ugly or whatever, and they no longer have anything to contribute to the conversation. That is an ad hominem fallacy. It uses traits to describe you that have absolutely nothing to do with the argument at hand, and again, are just deflecting from the fact that they're not actually arguing the point that they have presented themselves. Then we have burden of proof. The burden of proof is the requirement to establish who is responsible for presenting evidence that proves or defeats a claim. The obligation on a party in a dispute to provide sufficient warrant for its position. So basically what that means is when you have the burden of proof, it is your job to prove your point. You've presented the argumentation and you have to prove, because you have the burden of proof, that what you're saying is true. Through facts, through evidence, through empirical, historical examples, it is your job to prove your point. And then last but not least, this one's probably going to be the most important one as we go through this segment of this book, red herring. Red herring is another argumentation style. A red herring is an argument that uses confusion or distraction to shift attention away from a topic towards a false conclusion. Red herrings usually contain an unimportant fact, idea, or event that has little relevance to the real issue. So basically, a red herring is when somebody is unable to defend exactly what it is that they're trying to prove. And instead of working harder to defend it or doing better research, what they do is they just start bringing up entirely irrelevant facts that have nothing to do with the argument at hand. And they start using that as a distraction to make themselves look like they know a lot about something, or make themselves look like they are correct or they're making a good point, kind of like a gotcha. And in reality, they're losing and they don't want you to know, or they're unprepared and they don't want you to know. So there you go. We had red herring, burden of proof, ad hominem fallacy, appeal to hypocrisy. We're through the boring part, but you'll need to know those as we dissect this. So, I wish you guys could see this book because I have so many notes and highlights and things written in the margins. It's unreal. And that was about the point where I realized there was no way I was going to be able to make one episode about one chapter. There's just too much. But I digress. I'll let you see for yourself. Let's dive in. So the very first thing I saw when I opened this book was the foreword. And the foreword is called A Note to Atheists. And it reads, "If you are a militant atheist, the kind who loves the writings of Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and that whole crop of arrogant unbelievers who are in such vogue today, please note that this book is not written for you." Shocker. My purpose is not to convince you to believe in God. Keep that in mind. What he just said, his purpose is not to convince you to believe in God, or to prove God's existence in any way. There it is again. He's trying to say that that's not his job, when later we'll get into why he's wrong. There are hundreds of books on the market that do that already. He says there are hundreds of books on the market that do that. He doesn't provide a single example of one of them, or one that he looks up to, or one that he thinks is good. So already we're having problems. He continues, "No, this book is not for you. It's about you." About in italics. "It's about all those wonderfully deceptive, malicious, ignorant, cowardly, and hateful things you say and do on a regular basis. This book is also not meant for agnostics who are sincerely searching for the truth, or for people who are angry at God because of some terrible suffering they have endured. Again, there are many good resources that attempt to help people who are honestly struggling with their faith." Again, does not provide a single example of one of those fantastic resources. Also, gotta love how he comes out of the gate just ripping and roaring, tearing into atheists and people who don't believe in God, and then suddenly backtracks. Suddenly he's like, but, unless you're really struggling, or, unless something happened to you, then this book isn't about you. When it is. He literally just said a note to atheists. He didn't say some atheists. He didn't say mean atheists. He said a note to atheists, and then he ripped into atheists. But then he decides to backpedal and make exceptions because apparently only some atheists are horrible in his perspective, even though he would say throughout this chapter that all atheists are horrible. This reminds me very much of when I lived in Chicago and I would be at a dinner party and somebody would start going off on Southerners. Usually this would come up in political discussions, and they would start talking about how all Southerners are dumb and racist and hillbillies and, super far right and all these things. And they would just go off. And I, being Southern, wouldn't say a word. I would just let them. I would just let them go off and rip and roar. And they would have no idea because obviously I don't meet any of those stereotypes. And then by the time they were done, just absolutely decimating Southerners or people from the South, I would let them know that I was Southern and I'd been sitting there the whole time and I heard everything. And the reason I like doing that is because they would immediately backtrack on everything it was that they said, and they would immediately discount every point that they made and be like, oh no, I didn't mean you. Like, you know what I mean. You know what I mean. I didn't mean you. I definitely didn't mean you. Like, not all, like not everyone, just, some of them, like the extreme ones, etc., etc. And it's always just really funny to see people backpedal very quickly when they're confronted. And I feel like that's very much what this guy is doing. He's worried about being confronted with the idea that potentially people are atheists for a multitude of reasons. Oh my God. And so instead of having to actually defend what he's saying and say, no, I mean it, I mean all atheists, instead he's quantifying and he's backtracking and he's covering some of his tracks just in case somebody gets upset or somebody makes a good point about an exception to the rule. So he continues to say, no, the focus of this book is on those obnoxious, aggressive, new atheists who not only reject God, but also wish to evangelize the whole world with their gospel of nothingness. First of all, if you're going to complain about people evangelizing the world with their gospel, come on. I'm just going to let that sit there. In the opinion of this writer, too many books written in response to these pseudo-intellectual blowhards have been altogether too nice. The authors have all tried to be kind and reasonable and amiable in an effort to demonstrate that believers don't have to sink into the mud in order to defend the faith. Maybe that's because you don't have to sink into the mud in order to defend your faith. Or at least you shouldn't have to. Maybe there's a reason for that. The tact is charitable and extremely admirable, but unfortunately it just doesn't work with bullies, and that's exactly what modern-day atheists are, bullies. So if you happen to be one of those militant atheists and you intend to read further, please don't expect that sort of kind and gentle approach you've experienced when dealing with believers. There won't be any coddling, respect for your views, friendly debate, dialogue, or turning the other cheek. Not in this book. I'm afraid there's only one way to deal with bullies, even in this politically correct world, and that is to crush them. Literally, though, he says that. He says to crush them, which I find the most ridiculous, bombastic, dramatic thing I've ever heard. But at the same time, he says, no friendly debate. So, all right, no friendly debate. I'll agree to those terms. Let's go. Chapter 1, The Arrogance of Atheists. So he starts off with this chapter by describing a child, an arrogant, spoiled child. And he's using this kind of to set a scene. He says, he talks about these children, these arrogant children that, quote unquote, we all know, which I don't know where he gets that. But he says, kids who for some reason think they know everything when in reality they know nothing. They're condescending, obnoxious, prone to shouting, mean-spirited, and selfish. Which I thought was odd that he claimed they're mean-spirited when so far this entire book, and we're only on page 1 of chapter 1, has been very mean-spirited, but whatever. They're the kids who are always bragging that they have better clothes, better sneakers, better toys, better video games, better houses, better everything than their friends. They never seem to learn humility. They're always clamoring to be first, always looking for attention, always screaming to be recognized as the best. And if, by chance, they aren't given the credit they think they deserve, then woe to the guilty culprit whose fault it is, because the person will be treated with a noisy temper tantrum. The type of arrogant children I'm talking about never take correction in a constructive way, which my first question, and I literally wrote this in the margin, was what about his book at all so far has been constructive? I have seen nothing constructive, but I guess, maybe this is that whole hypocrisy thing we were talking about. They never take any kind of challenge to their superiority. Their first reactions are always anger and petulance, which, again, is pretty ironic considering how angry and petulant the verbiage and the tone of this entire book has been so far. And again, this is page 2 now. Even worse, these children never seem to know when to keep their opinions to themselves. As someone once said of them, 2/3 of what they think on a topic are borrowed from their parents or older siblings, and the remaining 1/3 is based on whether they have immediate desire for something. So, first of all, 2/3 of what they think on a topic is borrowed from their parents or older siblings, and the remaining 1/3 is based on whether they have an immediate desire for something. Can this exact same thing not be said about literally any opinion ever? Anybody I know who is driven by politics, anybody I know who's driven by religion, anybody I know who's driven by whatever field they choose to go into, 90% of the time, their thoughts and opinions on those things come from their parents initially, and then the rest is later developed either by their friend circle or the people that they surround themselves with or themselves. I remember I read a study once that was talking about how children oftentimes know what religion they're a part of before they even know what religion means. A child can tell you they are a Catholic, they are a Baptist, they are a Jewish, they are a Muslim, before they even really know what that means, because your parents' ideas influence your ideas regardless of who you are. He's trying to say petulant, immature, stupid children with too loud opinions are the ones who are like that, but everyone's like that. You're a Republican, or you're a Democrat, or you're religious, or you're not, usually from the beginning based on who you were raised around. And it isn't until later in life when you surround yourself with a more diverse group of people that you sometimes change your mind. Some people don't even change their mind then. But whether a child's arrogance is a consequence of wealth, upbringing, immaturity, insecurity, or simply natural disposition, the end result is always the same: rudeness and bad behavior. So it's wild to me because he then goes on to say that this child's behavior could be caused by a innumerate number of outside factors, which I entirely agree with. But then later on he says, this image of the typical arrogant, condescending, bullying child that I've just described is, in actuality, the exact picture of the typical modern-day atheist. But then he doesn't go on to describe why. He doesn't even go on to describe what he means or where he found this or what example he's talking about. So he describes this arrogant child who has too boisterous of an opinion that they got from their parents. And then he's like, even though that kid's attitude came from like 6 different external factors, that's the same way the atheists are. It's like, what? It doesn't even make any freaking sense. That's right. Just as we've all seen spoiled, misbehaving children in action, we've also witnessed the spectacle of new atheists spreading their particular brand of toxic arrogance through society. You know who they are. They're the ones who are offended by the slightest bit of religious imagery in public, the ones who are mortified if even a whisper of Merry Christmas escapes the lips of some well-meaning but naive department store clerk during the holiday season, the ones who object vehemently to the phrase, "In God we trust," on money or the walls of the government building. So first of all, I'm like, what is he talking about? Where is he seeing these atheists out here freaking out, stomping their feet, not allowing people to say Merry Christmas, etc.? Yeah, sure, I know a few years back we had the whole Starbucks drama because they wanted to be more inclusive on their cups, but that had literally nothing to do with atheists. That had to do with people who don't celebrate Christmas, people who celebrated Hanukkah, things like that. They just wanted to be more inclusive, so they made a neutral cup. But that had nothing to do with atheists. Atheists weren't marching through the streets demanding this, so I don't know what he's talking about. But then this last sentence, he says, the ones who object vehemently to the phrase, "In God we trust," on money or the walls of government buildings. This should be the case because there is literally, most literally, a separation of church and state in our original laws. So anybody who's making a fuss about having "In God we trust" on the money and written on the walls of government buildings is correct. They are doing the right thing. They are upholding what is supposed to be the original belief of the American Constitution. So again, don't see how that's a bad thing. Sorry you've run into 1 million people who don't let you say Merry Christmas. I've never met one, but I apologize that happened to you. But if you are advocating for "In God We Trust" to be on the walls of government buildings, you're simply incorrect, because there is supposed to be, and this was written by the founding fathers. This is not a liberal atheist idea, a separation of church and state. The church should not be, as it is all the time, mandating laws and clauses and lifestyle allowances in our country. Anyway, he says these are self-righteous twits. First of all, who's the bully? I'm a little bit confused, because the further I read in this book, the more I'm starting to think maybe he's the bully, which is very ironic because he's trying to describe bullies and he's quite literally describing himself. These are self-righteous twits who cause a storm of protest whenever something overtly religious is spoken of in anything but hushed tones or behind closed doors. So this is ridiculous, first of all, this idea that he is basically painting a picture of Christians being persecuted by atheists because they're not allowed to talk about religion outside of closed doors or hushed tones. Not the case. The exact same man who just said the words "In God We Trust" are on the walls of government buildings and printed on our money is also turning around 2 sentences later and saying that he's not allowed to speak about religion other than hushed tones because the atheists are going to come get him. Give me a break. Choose one. Which is it? You're not persecuted. Grow up. If you want to talk about real persecution, talk to people of color, talk to Jews, talk to Muslims, talk to, women even. If you want to talk about persecution, Christianity in America is not persecution. And that's a hill I'm going to die on. I promise. So then he says, I'm not going to focus on proving God's existence or showing how much sense it makes to be a believer. So this is the second time in his book he's mentioned that he's not going to talk about proving God exists or showing how good it is to be a believer or how beneficial it is. And this is a fallacy. It is his job. He has the burden of proof, ladies and gentlemen, and friends in between. Burden of proof, the requirement to establish who is responsible for presenting evidence that proves or defeats a claim, the obligation on a party in a dispute to provide sufficient warrants for its position. He started this. He literally started this. Nobody asked, and he started it. And now he's going to backtrack and say, but also I don't have to prove anything to you. Yeah, I'm going to write a book about how much you suck and how you're wrong, but I'm not going to prove that I'm right. Meh. That's a fallacy, ladies and gentlemen, and don't let anybody ever pull that bullshit on you, because that's what it is. It's bullshit, and this guy is dumb. Dumb. If he's going to call names, I'm going to call names. If he's going to call me a twit, I'm going to call him an idiot. Because anybody with 2 eyeballs can see that it is actually his burden of proof to prove that God exists and that he is correct if atheists are incorrect. And he's not going to do it because he's lazy and he's a coward. Moving on. Rather, my main purpose here will be to expose once and for all the blatant hypocrisy. Ladies and gentlemen and friends in between, there it is, that word hypocrisy. His appeal to hypocrisy focuses on the opponent, deflecting criticism away from oneself by accusing the other person of the same problem or something comparable. And there it is. It's almost like I knew this was coming. Wild. Then he says, when you really look at what the new atheists are saying, you don't find a carefully constructed logical argument against the theistic position. Honestly, in this book, I'm not finding a logical argument or a fully constructed position on his side either. So it goes back to that whole who's the real hypocrite. He says, in fact, you don't find any argument at all. What you find is a lot of hot air, a lot of bluster, a lot of disdain, a lot of unfounded and empty dogmatism. Above all, what you find is arrogance. So this is another thing he does. He uses a lot of descriptive words to evoke a feeling or an emotion out of you so that you don't notice he doesn't provide any examples whatsoever. Notice here, he doesn't give one single solitary example, a real world, actual example, not a theory, not a story of when he has seen this. He hasn't mentioned, I was at the convention of such and such in this year, or, if you read in the news lately, so-and-so did this. There's no examples here. He just spouts out all these trigger words that he knows are going to incite a reaction out of his audience, his very narrowly scoped audience. And instead of defending what he's saying, he moves on and he hopes you don't realize through his big vocabulary, that he's not actually saying anything or proving anything. Arrogance has been a calling card of atheists for a long time. It didn't start with Richard Dawkins or Bill Maher. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great patron saint of atheism and, coincidentally, the favorite philosopher of Adolf Hitler, a fact atheists conveniently neglect to mention, proclaimed famously in the 19th century that God was dead and in his grave. So, let's backpedal again. This, ladies and gentlemen, is called a red herring. This is where the red herring comes in. Notice, he's trying to make a point about atheists who believe in Richard Dawkins and the teachings of Bill Maher, if you can call them teachings. And then he goes on to say that Friedrich Nietzsche is the patron saint of atheism, and then he immediately turns into a comparison on Nietzsche and Hitler, right? This move is so classic. This move is so basic and lazy that in all the years that I was in a competitive debate, the number one rule is don't compare your opponent to Hitler. Because one, they're never as bad as Hitler, and two, it's dumb and it's lazy, and all you're doing is trying to evoke emotion. Because what you do is you compare somebody to Hitler and then they freak out because obviously they don't want to be compared to Hitler, and then they stop focusing on their argumentation and instead start defending how they're not Hitler, and you think you've won. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a red herring. He's using ridiculous facts. So what? So Adolf Hitler liked Friedrich Nietzsche. Guess what? Adolf Hitler also liked cognac. He also liked paintings. He also liked reading. He also liked classical music. Let's do it. Let's go. We can go all day long with this bullshit. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a lazy argumentation, and the fact that I'm even touching on it is a waste of my time. Then he says, militant atheists of the 21st century have raised this kind of pretentious egotism to an art form. So here he's about to do something that I want you guys to notice. What he's going to do is he's going to use adjectives, again, like he did a moment ago, that provoke an emotion and that provoke a response. And then he's going to quote these people with very normal, regular sentences. What he wants to do is he's going to describe these people in a way that makes you read their quote in a tone that was not intended for the quote. Let me give you an example. He says, Sam Harris superciliously writes, "It is time that we admitted that faith is nothing more than the license religious people give one another to keep believing when reasons fail." Now, supercilious. That means behaving or looking as though one thinks one is superior to others. So what he's doing is, instead of saying, Sam Harris said this thing, he's saying, Sam Harris, who thinks he's better than everyone else and thinks he's superior to all of us, says, and he wants you to read the quote like, "It is time that we admitted that faith is nothing more than the license religious people give to one another to keep believing when reasons fail." That's what he wants you to do. He places this very particular, very specific adjective after Sam Harris so that you think, because most people who are reading this book and enjoying this book probably haven't spent a lot of time listening to Sam Harris. They don't know what he sounds like. They don't know, they're not familiar with his candor. They think he's going to say this with this pompous and angry tone. When in reality, if you've ever spent 5 seconds listening to Sam Harris speak about anything, he hardly raises his voice, right? So he wants to evoke that emotion with you. Then he does it again. He says, Richard Dawkins haughtily states, "Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." So Richard Dawkins haughtily, the definition of haughtily being in an unfriendly way, seeming to consider yourself better than other people. So instead of saying, Richard Dawkins said, "Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of the lack of evidence." Totally normal sentence. He says, Richard Dawkins haughtily stated it because he wants you to think faith is belief in spite of, or perhaps of, the lack of evidence. Dumbass. That's how he wants you to read this, because he wants to evoke that response. He later goes on to say Christopher Hitchens is condescendingly pontificates. Big words, because he wants to distract you from the fact that he is saying nothing, and he is proving nothing. So he goes on to describe what he thinks atheists believe, and he gets it right for kind of a second there. He says, since there is absolutely no empirical or scientific evidence of God, there can be no rational basis to believe in him. Since God can't be seen, felt, or heard with the senses, and since there isn't any geological or fossil record of him, and since he can't be proven mathematically, he simply can't exist. But then he adds, period, like the word, period. So again, instead of being like, yeah, I haven't seen enough evidence to suggest that God is real, I haven't seen fossils or historical empirical evidence, I'm just not sure, it just doesn't seem real to me, I have to see skeletons of dinosaurs in order to believe in them, I have to see fossils in the ocean, in order to believe in previous marine life, I have to see cavemen in museums to believe that they're real. He's saying, period, the end, y'all dumb. That's what he's acting like atheists act like, which is ridiculous. They surmise this dependence on religion comes from three primary sources: fear of death, an unwillingness to accept the permanent loss of loved ones, and an inability to cope with life itself. Again, doesn't mention a single source. I have no idea where these three primary sources come from. He doesn't say he polled atheists. He doesn't say he got these from atheists he knows. Nothing. All he says is, by the way, atheists believe that the only reason we are religious is for these three primary sources, which is utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. If you're going to make a statement like that, you need to, this whole time you're going to hear me say evidence, stats, evidence, stats, evidence, stats, resources, resources, resources. If you're going to put quotation marks around something, who are you quoting? Where is it coming from? This is literal basic research, and I'm literally embarrassed for this publication company that they took this manuscript as weak as it is and they decided to publish it. Now, let me start off by saying, I'm not shitting on this guy because he's religious at all. This could be a book about literally any opinion whatsoever. It could be political, it could be religious, it could be anything. And it's the arrogance and the rudeness and the direct confrontational dictation, I suppose I should say, that is what I am utterly shitting all over. Because this guy wants to open these floodgates, but he doesn't want to, 1, prove that he's right, 2, prove that God's real, 3, list any sources, 4, make any attempt at research whatsoever. This guy had an opinion and he got mad and he probably had a fake conversation in his head the way that we all do and pumped himself up and decided to write a book. And because he's obviously hobnobbing with big wigs who agree with him, he got his book published. That's what happened here. He even goes on to say, this is not an exaggeration. This is truly what the new atheists believe. Again, doesn't even cite any sources. But he goes on to say, read God is Not Great by Hitchens, The God Delusion by Dawkins, or The End of Faith by Harris. The titles of these books betray the attitude of the authors. I don't know, kind of like Inside the Atheist Mind, Unmasking Religion of Those Who Say There Is No God. Kind of. He says, the bottom line is that atheists today do not acknowledge any connection between faith and reason. This is so dumb and could not be further from the truth. In fact, in my personal experience, the majority of atheists I know actually very much understand why Christians believe what they do, or religious people in general believe what they do. They very much recognize that due to the way you were raised, the way that you were taught to think and believe and operate, depending on the laws in your country, it is very beneficial for you to be religious, especially when they say things like there's going to be an afterlife and you're going to see people that you love. Who wouldn't want to believe in that, right? So first of all, reasoning behind why somebody is devoted to faith is absolutely, completely understandable. And atheists, we get it. We get it. We don't agree, but we get it. I've never spoken to an atheist who said, I just don't see the blah, 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 blah. No, that's bullshit. It's bullshit. Now, is there probably a keyboard warrior somewhere on Reddit spewing this shit? Yes. But I think there's a lot more people spewing pro-religious things that are making waves and saying rude things and being borderline racist that I can point to. And it's sad because this guy is making all Christians look bad. That's the saddest part, is this guy is making it seem like religious people are hateful and aggressive towards those who aren't. And that could not be the case. Some of the best people I know are religious people. He's just a terrible example of one. He goes on to say, even the most cursory glance at history shows the whole discipline of rational thinking on this planet, as well as all of our scientific knowledge, comes not from atheists, but from the minds of men and women who believe deeply in God. So then he goes on to give examples of Christians who did many, many great things and invented great things. For example, he starts with Aristotle. He says, the great Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, being an ancient Greek philosopher, didn't know anything about the founders of the world's major religions, but the man who organized and classified human thinking into categories such as biology, physics, zoology, and epistemology, and the man who is still recognized today as perhaps the greatest thinker who ever lived, did believe in divine intelligence. Okay? So first, just to be a dick, I made my own red herring, kind of like he did with the Hitler thing. And I'm like, well, Aristotle also thought that women were monstrous. Literally, that's a quotation. You can look it up. And then he said, Aristotle was known to say that women have fewer teeth than men, which I thought was odd, especially because you can literally count people's teeth while they're standing in front of you. But he truly believed that women were not quite human, they were monstrous, and that they had fewer teeth than men. He also was known to believe that some people, quote, deserve to be slaves, end quote. Naturally subservient people deserve to be slaves. Aristotle argued that there were some people that did not have naturally subservient behavior, and some people who did, and those who were naturally subservient deserved to be slaves, which I think is ridiculous. But I'm just saying, if he's going to pull the whole, by the way, the beliefs of the people that you look up to are also awful, let's talk about the beliefs of the people he looks up to. Also, something that he fails to point out, and that I'm going to point out, is he is under the impression that if you agree with one thing that somebody does, you agree with everything that somebody does. If you like Nietzsche and Hitler liked Nietzsche, you are the same person. But that's not true at all. People can like some ideas that somebody has and not like other ideas that somebody has. How many times have you downloaded an album and liked 3 of the songs and just left the rest to their own devices, right? You can believe in everything that Aristotle, or the majority of what Aristotle said, you can believe in physics and biology and zoology and epistemology and not believe in God. Just because you think somebody is right most of the time doesn't mean you think somebody is right all the time, but he's not ready to have that conversation. So then he goes on to talk about Francis Bacon. With Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism. Empiricism is the theory that all knowledge is derived from sense and experience, a position so dear to the hearts of atheists today. Bacon is also the person credited with establishing the inductive method of experimental science. In other words, he was the man who created the scientific method itself. Did he believe in God? Yes, he did, and he was a devout Christian too. In fact, his last written words were from the form of a prayer. Be merciful unto me, O Lord, for my Savior's sake, and receive me into thy bosom. Great. Francis Bacon was also accused of corruption. Francis Bacon took bribes. Francis Bacon's grandfather, Sir Anthony Cook, was a humanist. Look up humanism. It's very interesting. It's usually hand in hand with atheism. Not always, but a lot of the time. And I think that's kind of interesting, right? So he does the exact same thing. He pinpoints people that are the greats, right? That believed in God, that are just as easy to discredit the way he tried to discredit Nietzsche earlier by saying, but also they did these awful things, or they said these awful things, or they believed these awful things. All I'm saying is he's pinpointing all of these amazing people who had amazing ideas and inventions and changed the world, who were also believers, but he's very, very conveniently ignoring everything else they did that doesn't go hand in hand with being a person of faith. So then he goes on for like a full other page to list off a bunch of other people in the very same way who invented a bunch of stuff and did a bunch of cool things and were also Christians, which is totally fine. There's no problem with that at all. Then he goes on to say, what do atheists make of this list? The list of names he's quoted. Nothing. They ignore and dismiss it as they ignore and dismiss so many other challenges to their thinking. I laughed out loud when I read that sentence. They dismiss so many other challenges to their thinking. Because one, that is so false. I'm literally sitting here breaking down line by line a book that quote unquote challenges my thinking, although challenge is a strong word. And then I'm going to reiterate, that's not true at all. You can agree with a lot of what someone says and not agree with everything someone says. I don't know any atheists who speak out against these people, these scientists and these inventors, just because they were Christians. Nobody does that. We're allowed to enjoy philosophy and medical sciences and things that came from people that had other beliefs that we did not necessarily agree with. It's just wild to me. And it's wild to me that he says people ignore and dismiss so many other challenges to their thinking when this guy's entire book, let me flip to the back. This book is, 219 pages of him being pissed off because he was confronted by people who challenged his way of thinking. So what the fuck is that about? It doesn't make any sense. Then I'm just going to skip a little bit more because this is just so irritating, and not in the way that he wants, by the way. I'm not even getting like pissed off. It's just such lazy writing. It's such lazy writing. It truly is. This guy's like, gotcha. Like this entire book is written like one big giant gotcha. Told ya. When in reality, he has proven nothing. In fact, the only examples he's had at all in 11 pages were names of famous people who also happen to be Christians, right? And if we deep dive into all of those famous people, I'm willing to bet they did drugs, or they had extramarital affairs, or they cut off their ear and sent it to their girlfriends, right? Like they did fucked up shit, but they also had good ideas, right? So you can believe some ideas that people come up with and not believe everything, right? I have my best friend in the entire world is a Republican. I'm a liberal Democrat. We get along on nearly every other aspect of our existence as human beings. Most of our opinions are entirely the same, except when it comes to politics. That does not make her wrong. That does not make me wrong. It just makes us individual people who can cherry pick the parts of each other's lives that we agree with and that we, want to focus on, instead of making all the disagreements the focus of the friendship. Anyway. So, to conclude, the last sentence I'm going to end on is, he talks about the Big Bang Theory and how the Big Bang Theory was apparently proposed by a priest, right? Then he says, yes, you heard that right. A priest came up with the Big Bang Theory. If you don't believe it, look it up. So yet again, instead of presenting his own research, instead of presenting his own sources, instead of proving that he did any research for this book whatsoever, he puts the burden on the audience to do their own work. And it is exhausting. But that's where I'm going to end this particular reading. It's not even the end of chapter 1 yet, you guys. That's not even the end of chapter 1. And I skipped a bunch of chapters just because there isn't enough time in a single day to cover all of the incorrect, wrong, mistaken, flagrant abuses of his platform that this person has put in his book. But I cannot emphasize to you enough that my hating on this guy has nothing to do with the fact that he's Christian at all. I don't think there's anything wrong with being Christian. If you want to be a Christian, you are more than welcome to be a Christian. Have at it. It is totally your thing. I have a problem with I keep saying this word, but it's the only one that really I think fits him, his bombastic, arrogant, ridiculous approach to a topic because he thinks he's being edgy. I've been teaching stand-up comedy for almost 10 years now, and there is always a student in my class on the first day who thinks they're edgy, who thinks they are going to be the edgiest person you have ever seen. And they usually tank day one because they didn't plan for anything after the edginess. They thought they were going to get up, tell their super edgy jokes, shock us, terrify us, disgust us, and we'd have to take a break because we've never seen something so edgy in our lives. But what actually happens is they're challenged and they're asked questions and they don't get the response that they want from their audience, and they're shocked and they're embarrassed because they didn't plan that far ahead. This guy did not plan that far ahead. He didn't do any real research. He had an opinion. It was a bloviated, ridiculous opinion with no facts or evidence to back up how he feels. He just wants to feel it. He feels persecuted for some reason, which is ridiculous, especially in our country. Absolutely fucking ridiculous. And he got a bunch of people who agreed just like him with the exact same opinions that he has to endorse this book that fits their agenda, and then he printed it. And I gotta say, I'm not excited about reading the rest of this. Not because I'm afraid of challenging my opinion or learning something, oh God. No, because it's lazy writing and it's going to be a waste of my time. But I'm going to do it just for you guys. You're welcome. Anyway, if you liked what you heard today, feel free to subscribe to this podcast. If you haven't already, you can find us on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, bye.